Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this online event for the Association of Jewish Refugees. My name is Karen Diamond, and I'm part of the outreach team for AJR. For anyone not familiar with AJR, we are the national charity supporting Britain's Jewish refugees and survivors of Nazi oppression, and we are committed to the education of others about the Holocaust. For more information about what we do, please go to our website. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. As is usual with our online events, we are going to keep everyone on mute, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions later on. Please write your questions in the chat function, and we'll do our best to include as many as possible. We are recording the session, and it will be made available on our YouTube channel. If you don't want to appear on the recording, simply turn off your camera. Thank you. So now I'd like to give a big welcome to our special guest, Jeremy King, OBE. Jeremy is the king in the powerhouse restaurateur partnership of Corbin and King that has been going strong for almost 40 years. They were the partnership behind the success of the iconic London restaurant, The Ivy, where you may have dined or at least read about in the papers because of its celebrity clientele. Today, Corbin and King run a group of restaurants, which includes famous London restaurants, The Walsley, a cafe restaurant in the grand European tradition, and Brasserie Zedel, a grand bustling Parisian brasserie in Piccadilly Circus. In 2014, Jeremy was awarded an OBE for his services to the hospitality industry and voluntary service to the arts. Welcome, Jeremy. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure, and thank you very much. And for those of you who waited an extra 2 or 3 minutes, can I just point out that was entirely my fault. I experienced a technical problem getting on, and in fact, unfortunately, we're going to be slightly blighted by it, because although you're looking at a screen with a car on, I almost dare not remove it at this moment as I'm speaking to you, because that was the culprit, is getting a PowerPoint display. So I'm going to apologize in advance that the PowerPoint may not be as full as you would expect. And it's going to just take us on a little journey through my life as a restaurateur. And Karen was asking me to, how I started. And I think typical of many people in my generation from the 60s, a little bit lost in where I was from, who I was, and in fact, even my greater heritage. I'm not, despite the name King, which is often a Jewish name, I'm not Jewish myself. My mother was a Chin, so often the Chinovskis, and by all accounts, they had come to Britain in the early 20s. But technically, I don't have I am not Jewish, although my family is, because my children were brought up Jewish through their mother, Deborah Howe. And I have enjoyed so much of Jewish tradition and life, and you'll start to feel that coming a little bit into the restaurants themselves. But there I was in Somerset, being educated at a local primary school, which had horrified my mother, because she felt that I was much brighter. And of course, in her early days of deciding that I was going to be prime minister, she decided I should actually go off to a better school than was perhaps locally. And I went to a blue coat school in Sussex called Christ's Hospital. And it's from there that I had complete indecision as to how my life would be conducted work-wise. I decided not to take up my place at university, somewhat on a whim, and slightly, some of you may have remembered a book which was very popular in the early 70s called The Dice Man, which is a book about a man who decides the plot of his life through the throw of a dice. And believe it or not, it's something which I did casually about where I might go to dinner or something, and then ended up throwing the dice on my life. And it made the decision that I wasn't going to go to university. I was going to become an incredibly successful financier. Not much came of that. The reason is because I happened to be logical, arithmetical, and so on, but I got really bored. And trying to discover my career, I got career advice. I was told that I would be a brilliant accountant. I said, no, I don't want to be an accountant. It doesn't feel right. I wouldn't mind being a turf accountant, you know, a bookmaker. And they said, that's brilliant. And I thought, no. And it ended up, I fell into the life of being a restaurateur. So I'm autodidact, entirely self-taught, which has been partly my strength, occasionally my weakness. And it was over a period of time that I started to work for a restaurant called Joe Allen in Covent Garden. Joe Allen, who sadly died only a few weeks ago, was a remarkable place itself, and it had originally started in New York. I knew it in Paris as well. And I was working as a maitre d'hotel, and it grew my love for theatre because it had such a theatrical group going there, and it stood me in great stead because this was 79. It was heady times. Cats was just being conceived by Cameron Mackintosh and Nick Allott, and a lot of the great plays at the time. And I made a great number of friends in the theatre. And secretly, I think I wistfully wished I'd been in the theatre. But of course, restaurateuring in a funny way is theatre. And often people notice the similarity. You learn your lines, you practice, you rehearse, and then suddenly it's makeup, costumes, and the curtains up, and you're performing. And it was strange because deep down, I'm an extremely shy person, but within the context of a restaurant, it gives a different form of stage and a certain sort of distance, which allows me to interact with people, which has given me a great deal of pleasure. And during that time, many of you might remember Langan's Brasserie, which was run eponymously by Peter Langan. And he approached me as a 25-year-old and said, I'm told that you should run my next restaurant. And I spent time looking for that restaurant with him, but more importantly, also spent a lot of time at Langan's Brasserie, where I met Chris Corbin. And we started to have a weekly dining club, and each of us trying to I suppose, outbid the other with unusual restaurant locations. I had the upper hand in many ways because he was living in West London. I was living in East London, well, in fact, in Wapping. And it was a time where you could still do, I mean, Bloom's, of course, was still going, and you could still do trips around. There was a great place called the Kosher Eating House. And I would take him to the most unusual places I could find. But strangely, I think it planted a kernel, a seed of the enjoyment of Jewish cuisine, which again comes up later. We eventually decided we were going to open a restaurant together. And it was actually with a fashion mogul, Joseph Otegui. Some of you may know the Joseph shops. And we went into partnership with him, an ill-fated partnership in many ways, because it lasted 4 months, but it gave birth to Le Caprice, founded on the site in Arlington House of the old Caprice, which interestingly was born out of the general manager previously of the Ivy, who, having been thwarted in his bid to become a partner with the original Ivy, was persuaded to open Caprice. It's on the same site, laid out differently, very much more plush. It was always thought to be the most plush restaurant of any in London, because there it was opening post-war, and they had silk, wonderful silk all over the walls. It was ruched silk, but in fact, what we discovered later is that the reason it was ruched silk is because they were using old parachutes, and you couldn't have flat silk, you had to ruche it up, and then dyed it with I think loganberries to get the rich pink color. And it was an extraordinary space which had fallen into disrepair and disrepute. But Chris saw it as our opportunity to open a restaurant. And although at the time it didn't work out with Joseph, who in turn became a very, very good friend, it did afford us one of the most important things, which was the complete control of Le Caprice in 1981. And we were able to do things which in many ways surprised and alienated many Londoners. But New Yorkers loved what we were doing. It was the time of restaurants like Odeon in New York, and we were doing something new. We tried to change the nature of restaurateuring because there'd been this wonderful movement in the late 60s when Mario and Franco had democratized restaurateuring, whereby places like the Terrazza in Soho, you would find the royalty sitting down with photographers, for instance, the likes of David Bailey and Donovan, and so on, and who would never have mixed before. There had always been a very strict class structure in restaurants, and this was being broken down by the Italians. And in time, we felt through Joe Allen's, through Langan's, in terms of Caprice. And we were happily there. I could talk for days about the wonderful times we had there, the people who'd come in, the nights when I remember being desperately trying to find a table for 8 because the film producer Norma Heyman was coming in. And then suddenly the Laurence Olivier table, which was celebrating his birthday, got up earlier than we expected to go, thank God. And as they were leaving, I saw flashlights. Oh no, Laurence Olivier is being troubled. But in fact, it wasn't. It was Norma Heyman's party of 8 who were going to take Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier's table were coming through the door, and within that group was Liz Taylor, who promptly sat down on the same seat that Laurence Olivier had done only minutes before. And even the sort of sang-froid of the Caprice customers in those days allowed for a lot of slack jaws, which you can, as you can imagine. It was a wonderful period. Of course, we became very close to the Princess of Wales. And as time went on, we thought we'll get another restaurant because it's a form of expression. And back in the 70s, when I'd actually been involved in with a restaurant company which also sold wine, a friend of mine had got involved with a restaurant on Upper St. Martin's Lane called Peppermint Park. It was a pretty ghastly place, but very popular at the time. And I looked up the road and I said, what's that place there? And we could just see the ivy. And he said, oh, it's an old-fashioned restaurant. It's past its time. Nobody goes there anymore. It's dusty and musty. And I thought, I'm going to go and look. And I sat there, and in the true fairy tale way, the person I took that night, back in what had been, I think, 1977, I said, if ever I own a restaurant, this is the restaurant I would want. And before I move on to the Ivy, and the sad thing about it is that a lot of these, my slides are going to be a little bit ad hoc now, so you're going to have to make sure to see that I'll ad lib. But that car sitting outside the Caprice, which was the car I bought in the early 80s, is still the car which sits outside the restaurants now. There's certain joy of having the same car for nearly 40 years. So we moved into the Ivy. Now, this was not the Ivy that I saw from Upper St. Martin's Lane, because it had that green light, but what it didn't have is further down, you'll see a Patrick Caulfield stained glass window, and there were other aspects of it, because what we did with the Ivy, which we first started to try and buy in 1983, and it took us 6 years to get, was indeed a very, very rundown place. So we wanted to do something new and contemporary, and we worked with a lot of the, what many were called pop artists of the day, to create an interior with, this is one example, this is Tom Phillips. His his portraits of people who started off as professionals, like, I don't know, Cézanne was the douanier, was the customs and excise, T.S. Eliot was in banking, etc. So just to show the rich, something really appealed to me is how we all find different routes in life. This is Edoardo Paolozzi, sadly no longer with us. Barry Flanagan, Barry Flanagan, some of you might know, always did sculptures with hares, became very famous. And this particular hare he called Stage Door Johnny to represent the position in the theatre. This is another view onto it with, it's gone straight out of my head who it is. It'll come back to me in a moment, of course, when it's too late. Peter Blake, he actually took a book which was called Mario of the Caprice, where he talked about his time at the Ivy, and these are all guests from their days at the Ivy. And he was trying to reflect the days when you went to the theatre and you bought a rose for your date and you took some black magic. And then there's a book there, which in these days, at the time, I think they thought it was very funny, which was a book that the owner of the Ivy had been given. And by one of the customers, he says, "My new book." And he said, "Oh, really?" And so opened up the book and it was full of blank pages. And he said, "I don't understand." He said, "Look at the title." And so with apologies for what now seems possibly inappropriate, but it was very fetid at the time. The book was called Everything I Know and Understand About Women, and hence with the blank pages, which caused all sorts of ribaldry. Then we moved on to Jay Shiki, another restaurant, and what you'll notice is there's a theme coming out here. Caprice had been big in the 40s. The Ivy went back to 1917. Shikis went back to 1896. And this is a restaurant which again had fallen on bad times. And we took in 1998 and again refitted the whole place. It's much bigger than it was in our day. I think it's actually been overexpanded. But it was full of a combination of paintings again. You might think we have an obsession of paintings. That what it was is we started to build stories, and this is an important part of what we've done with restaurants. And the story here was that the proprietor used to allow artists, post-First World War artists, to eat free within the restaurant, and that they would do it in exchange for paintings. And we were trying to make, conch shells for lighting and so on, to try and make it still evoke the past with all these photographs which have been given by customers over the years, but within a completely rebuilt environment. So 1998, that was open. In 2000, we left those restaurants. We were offered, seemed a fair amount of money at the time. Chris had gone through leukemia. In fact, the week after we opened the Ivy, Chris had been diagnosed with having myeloid leukemia, for which he wasn't expected to survive, and had bone marrow transplant in 1994, not long after we'd opened the Ivy. And when we were offered by Luke Johnson in 2000, quite a considerable sum of money, and we thought this is the time that we should move on, fulfill other dreams. Because remember, I never set out to be a restaurateur. I'm doing this, I've learned it, I'm enjoying it. I like the interaction, and restaurants have been very good to me, but I also wanted to get involved in hotels. So in 2000, we left and spent time trying to acquire a hotel. The result of which is that we failed. And one day we just lost yet another site. And it's an interesting time, because we're talking just, first of all, post 9/11. when hotels seemed to be very available because nobody's traveling. And then suddenly it turned the other way, apparently, because the interest rates were low and so on and so forth. By the way, I'm just going to mention at this point, one of the technical problems I had is that I may get thrown off from this particular laptop for about 20 seconds to 30 seconds. If it happens, please don't go away. I will be back very quickly. I actually thought I'd cured it because I was on Question Time last week and I got thrown off twice actually doing it on Question Time remote, which was a bit hair raising. So if it happens now, please don't give up on me. So having just lost yet another hotel, we were being pushed around by people with more money. I was speaking to the agent. I said, what are we going to do? And he said, go back into restaurants. I said, I'm not sure I want to. And he said, look, there's a site on Piccadilly called China House, which has just come up. I think you might like it. I said, that's an old bank. They don't work. No, I'm not interested. Actually, it wasn't an old bank. It was an old car showroom. And extraordinarily, to think that people would build car showrooms like that in 1921, but it was the pent-up excitement of an architect who was trying to build it before the war. And as those who've been there will know it's a glorious building. They somewhat ruined it as China House, painted it brown interior. They'd put in palm trees and all sorts of strange things. I took Chris down and we stood at the entrance and I said, what do you think? And he said, well, you've always dreamt of doing a Grand Cafe, a European Grand Cafe. Isn't this the one? I said, yes, but I was scared to do it. And he said, no, come on, you want to do it, let's do it. So the Wolsey was born. Now, sadly, in this particular slideshow, which was my recovered one, it doesn't have all the grand interiors, which the other did. So please forgive me. All it has is some of the detail. And these actually came from a book called Breakfast at the Wolsey, which some of you may have come across. So forgive me on not having the interiors. But Wolsey, after a really shaky start, and believe it or not, it was really hard to get going. Of course, started to attract a wide group of people. And one of the things I love about restaurateuring is the Grand Cafe notion, because it's egalitarian. And I say to the staff always, when you see somebody coming through the door, don't look at them as an opportunity to make money. Look at the opportunity to give somebody a good time. And if you give them a good time, you will make money. And it's important that people understand that a lot of the most interesting people that come to restaurants are actually the least affluent. And I kind of like the idea that the richer people subsidize them. So whether you want to come in for a coffee or champagne and oysters and so on and so forth, you're welcome. Anybody is welcome. And it's my credo anyway, in terms of egalitarianism. And it's, anybody who heard me talk on Question Time will probably hear how I was lauding the vaccine process, because it's entirely fair. It doesn't matter how rich you are, what your advantages are, you do not get preference. It's purely on merit and age and so on. Next up came the Delaunay. This came along end of 2011, and again in the Grand Cafe basis. And at the very front of that building, anybody who knows it, you'll see there is a cafe, a normal cafe called The Counter, which originally wasn't part of the restaurant we were getting, but we were told that it was going to go to something like, Pret or so on. So I said, no, we'll do that, because we can make that work. And that became the story of, I imagine, two people leaving Europe in the 30s, two brothers, and not getting to America and deciding to open the cafe or The Counter, and then expanding it, and then opening a restaurant afterwards. So it came in that way. And you'll see a lot of the same sort of traits of the Wolsey, but with a lower ceiling and a different feel. So at no time does it pretend to be the Wolsey, but it's certainly a friend. And one of the questions people often ask is, what about the names? Well, the Wolsey course, was taken from the fact that it was originally a Wolseley car showroom. And on the grand cafes and bigger brasseries, we continue the car name. So this car name is the Delaunay, and the Delaunay Belleville. And it's, you know, names are odd unless they're very, very specific to what we're doing. A name actually becomes good if the restaurant's good. And when you think of it, Caprice is a very strange name. The Ivy, I mean, if we did word association, you'd think poison ivy, perhaps, you know, so it's fascinating how they develop. But again, a strong emphasis on art and paneling and so on, which you'll see here. And then come 2012, we were opening Zedel, and it was a hectic year. 2011, November, we opened the Delaunay. June 2012, we opened Zedel. Zedel plays into this feeling I have about accessibility. If anything, I slightly made it for my kids, because the idea that you could go to a big restaurant and eat very cheaply. Anybody who knows Paris might have come across Bouillon Chartier, which is a very egalitarian restaurant, quite rough and ready in its way, and you share tables, but extraordinarily cheap and accessible. And this is what we wanted Zedel to be. And the lovely thing about it is you go through these doors off the street, and some people, some of you, if you were active in the 80s, will have remembered this site as being the Atlantic Bar and Grill. But you go into a cafe, which looks like any sort of Parisian cafe. If you actually inspect all the photographs, there's all sorts of histories of Soho and everything going on. And it's slightly Alice in Wonderland, because if you see to the top right there, the brasserie sign, and this is geared out, actually, the flags are because for the July the 14th Bastille Day celebrations. You go down the stairs and you enter into this lobby, and you're 2 flights down, and you'll see there's an American bar. There's and through the end we'll go into a room which surprises people, and this is the main brasserie, 260 seats, but you can eat a 3-course meal there with wine for £19.75. Although sadly after the pandemic it may have to go up somewhat. This just gives a feel for it, and it's a remarkable building. All that marble is real. We inherited that. Luckily, it was listed. And this is the what used to be the smoking room for the old Regent Palace Hotel, which we're under. The Regent Palace was the largest hotel in Europe, over 1,000 rooms when it was built at the beginning of the 20th century. Extraordinary place. Although it is fair to say that when it eventually closed, the police said that the crime statistics around that area of Soho went down 10% because the hotel was cleared out. I think there was a certain amount of drug dealing and other nefarious things. Josephine Hart Josephine Baker, sorry, I said Josephine Hart, Josephine Baker. Again, we go into something. I remember taking Chris into this room when it was just an empty room, no curtains, no bar or anything like that. And I was showing him around because I said, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. He said, okay. So, well, what are we going to do with this room? And I didn't know, but I like those moments because suddenly inspiration comes. And I said, we're going to do cabaret. And he went, oh my God, no. But actually, it's been wonderful because it's not particularly profitable, if at all, but it brings two of the ingredients that I think are so important for a restaurant, which is heart and soul. And this is what the Crazy Coqs gives. Next up, in October that year, was Colbert. I remember racing around trying to get that ready. The late, great Adrian Gill betting me money that we'd never open anywhere near the time he expected. And our stories started to come through. This is a story of I always imagine a Frenchman who got chased out of Paris for misbehaving and went to Chelsea because, of course, in pre-war Chelsea was actually one of the cheapest places to be in London. And this was an old pub, and which he opened. And if ever you go to Colbert, you'll see there's 3 rooms, and the 3 rooms are all entirely different, all have different histories. Ask one of the staff to show you through. The bar room is about London and Chelsea at that time. The corner room is about Paris during the war, and the far room is all about French movies, etc. So if you start to look, why is it called Colbert? Well, you know, I often think that he felt, well, there's the Grand Colbert in Paris he was emulating, or there was the Vicomte Colbert, who was Louis XIV's main man. There was the Comité Colbert. But actually, if the clue is in the restaurants, if you look, there's three pictures of Claudette Colbert, and I think he just had a bit of a penchant for it. So, and this, again, we're trying to evoke another period. This is Pierre, who the imaginary owner who built it all, and it's full of history and memory. But all these photographs are not just bought lock, stock, and barrel. They're actually, everyone has a story about Chelsea. And you could see actually Laurence Olivier there in the middle, playing in the Entertainer. And that's, for me, is part of the fun of it. There are even paintings done by my uncle, who was a painter during the war. And this floor, just by way of example, is from copied from a restaurant in the Bastille in Paris. It's called the Horseshoe and Feu de Cheval. And it gives you a general feeling. And then on to Fischer's, by which time the stories were developing. And Fischer's, again, I walked into this site, I knew I wanted it, but I was being asked by the investors, what's it going to be? I said, I don't know yet, but I'll work it out. And then suddenly it occurred to me is that the Fischers were a Jewish man and his Catholic wife who escaped Vienna in the 30s. And of course, you know, we're moving now into the world of refugees. And a lot of the refugees who came to this country either went to the East End, certainly if you were poorer, or to northwest, the suburbs of northwest London, or even closer. And I suddenly had this feeling this would be the ideal starting point for the story. And anybody who knows Vienna will know there's a famous restaurant called Zum Schwarzen Kamel, and there's a lot of detail from there taken up from there. And the place is full of the sort of things that somebody, as a refugee living in London, worked in the restaurant business, what would they do? They would open this site. And of course, we have a wonderful following from descendants or even people who'd come over at that time. And if you start to look at all these pictures, you got Stefan Zweig and Jacob Kramer and people like that. Stefan Zweig over here are all very much part of the place. And this slide actually doesn't, if you know the place, you would know that actually at the moment there are animals up on that wall, all of them wearing actually at present face masks to be in line. But the place has evolved just as any restaurant should. And a lot of people come over from Austria and feel very, very much at home, and gives you a little bit of the detail here. I'm extraordinarily proud of Fischer's. It's come on since the slideshow. I'm sorry I haven't got the more up-to-date version, but it gives me immense pleasure. So that wallpaper at the top is Moser, who is one of the great designers of Vienna. And so it goes on. The tiling is from Zum Schwarzen Kamel. And this is the painting, the mural is from the town hall. And then there's a little bit of a tragic story, which is my dream was finally realized of opening a hotel. And this is where the story, it took several years, where my main story was, because this was the story of, decided was an American hotelier, general manager, escaping he is coming to London at the behest of his customers to open a hotel. Actually,
Jeremy, sorry, could you just repeat his name, because you cut out a bit. So where you started talking about.
Repeat. Oh my, you know, and if I get kicked off, don't forget, I'll be back. This is Jimmy Beaumont, James Beaumont. It was my imaginary person. James Beaumont had been in London at the end of the First World War, and of course this is just around the corner from the American embassy. That was, and because prohibition was so horrible in New York for hoteliers, there's no drink, there's no customers, there's violence, etc. It was all very much boardwalk empire sort of feel. His backers persuaded him to open this hotel. That's in my imagination. It was actually built as a garage, that forecourt is for petrol, and it used to park upstairs, and there was full service, and chauffeurs used to hang out here whilst they went over to their bosses would go over to Selfridges, because we're just below Selfridges. And I poured heart and soul into this, and we had a fantastic time. Everybody got involved. My wife was buying pictures and so on. Actually, thinking of which, buying pictures, those of you who go to Fisher's, it's really worth mentioning, is at the very end of the room, there is a large oil painting, which was found in Czechoslovakia by my wife. And sometimes people think it's painting of me. It's not. It's a remarkable find, because we discovered it was Richard Tauber, who in the early part of the 20th century was the world's greatest tenor, as big as Pavarotti and so on and so forth. Some of you may have come across him. And he moved himself to London and lived in Northwest London. And I always rather thought that he would have been friendly with the Fishers, and hence his painting was there. And this hotel was full of them. Now, on this particular roll, there are far too many photographs. I'm going to go through quickly and just stop if there's interest. I suppose the most beguiling thing is this sculpture in the top left corner, which is actually by Antony Gormley. And one of the things about building at that time is you had to do public art, and I didn't want to do gratuitous public art, so I asked Antony Gormley to create something, and he said, should we have a go at creating a room within a sculpture? And that's exactly what that is. It was quite a story. We haven't got time to dwell too long, and I'm taking you through very quickly, just so you get the feel. This is the sort of mentality I have. Even getting lift shafts with those pointers was really important, and the people who populate the restaurant and the bar, etc. As you can see, I love history. I love the recreation of history, but within a contemporary situation. This is how much I enjoy. The sad thing about, I won't comment, that's the Antony Gormley in profile, gives you an idea. And this is the Antony Gormley inside. It's just a bed and a big window if you want it, or darkness. There's not even a television in there. It's meant to be one of the most exciting experiences. Sadly, the Beaumont went. Is a very long story. It became a fight between my investors with Grosvenor and so on and so forth, and I won't bore you with it, but we no longer have the Beaumont, but we're very proud of it. What we did open subsequently is 2 more restaurants, one called Belanger, which is in Islington, and again, Belanger is also a car. In fact, strangely enough, Monsieur Belanger, who started the Belanger car group, actually worked for Monsieur Delaunay, and that came And just in case you're wondering, Zedel was also a French car, which ended up being manufactured in Switzerland. If you go in there, you'll see in the bar, the only color photograph is of a Zedel car. And again, we're back in Brasseries. We're very happy having dogs into the place. This has actually changed because some of you might know we closed this restaurant because we thought it wasn't going to work. And then during the pandemic, opened it up again and redecorate and so on. It's been an immense success. So that takes you there. Now you'll say, well, hang on a second, where's Soutine? Because we've been very, very blessed with Soutine in St. John's Wood, and which I've immensely enjoyed. The story there is about painters at the St. John's Wood art school, which was a remarkable school because at the end of the 19th century, it actually encouraged women to become artists, which was unheard of at the time, and was a feeder school. And the whole story there, and I won't do it like particularly without pictures, and why it's called Soutine is because the person who ran the Center for French and English Art in St. John's Wood had come back from between the war movement into the Paris movement, which was actually almost entirely made up of refugees, Russian, Middle Europe, etc., who came to Paris, Modigliani, Chagall, and so on, and of course Soutine. And Soutine's great love was painting food and people who worked in restaurants. So that's just a bit of an insight into this crazy mind of how I, as a restaurateur, can't think of it in terms of just putting food on plates and serving it. It's about life. And I think restaurants have always been the great catalysts for so much to go on. You know, if we'd all look back on our best experiences in restaurants and the things we've done. Somebody said earlier on, that's why I told my parents that I was pregnant. There's an amazing number of things. We've all done it. We've met our friends, we've gone with our family. We've done job interviews. We've been fired in restaurants. We've seduced in restaurants. Sadly, some people divorce in restaurants, but the great restaurants are the catalyst for anybody to make of it, and hence the sort of restaurants I create. So I hope that was of an interesting insight into what we do.
That's great. Thank you, Jeremy. Could you tell us now, talk about the pandemic a bit and hospitality, and obviously it's been so affected. Tell us what's happening and you know how it's affected your restaurants and stuff like that. Plans for the future.
Well, rather tantalizingly, I was on a call about the future, and before I came on to meet with yourself, and this is where at the point when we discovered that my technology wasn't working as well. And meanwhile, the budget was going on. I'm in this strange position that I have no idea what happened in the budget, which is weird in a way because a lot hangs for restaurants upon this very budget. The estimate was that 10,000 hospitality operations closed in 2020. 4,000 were open, and we're now anticipating 25,000 closures in 2021. And it's a tricky thing because in hospitality, there are over 3 million directly employed in restaurants, and a very high proportion, 50% of them, in the age of 18 to 24, and they're the hardest hit of all the redundancies. It's a major impact on on the country. And whilst we've already lost 650,000 people from the trade, I think another 350,000 will come. I imagine that the furlough has been confirmed as extended through to September. I haven't seen yet, but you know, even that, whilst it's very useful, the cost of furlough to me per month, and this is not including the people I top up on wages, because furlough itself is a maximum of 30,000 a year. So for a senior manager who may have been with us for 15 and 20 years, they can't live on 30,000 a year with family and mortgages and so on. And this was made worse by the fact that the government made a mistake on calculating furlough for hospitality because they didn't allow service charge to be included, which is the main source of income. So most of my staff have been on 40% of income. And we've been very lucky we made an appeal to customers and said, if you buy a voucher to come in the future, we'll give 50% of the value to the staff to top up wages. And we had an immense reaction to that. But even as I was saying, on furlough, it's still costing me £80,000 a month just to keep the staff on furlough with national insurance and so on and so forth. So we really are facing a crisis because most of the restaurateurs that I know are sitting on rent debt amounting to 15 months now because they've just had to pay up. Again, we'll do at the end of March. The amount of money that most people calculate for the next 18 months, as long as they trade profitably, they may just get enough money to pay off their debts. Because the debts of a company like mine runs to millions just to keep the place going. Some landlords have been great. You know, some of you may have your own experience, but the likes of Cadogan, Howard de Walden, they're no longer mine, but Grosvenor actually have been pretty good. The Crown, etc., have all been really exemplary. But there's a lot of landlords who are demanding every penny and running people out of their businesses. It's only because there's a moratorium on eviction that people are still there. And we in restaurants are very optimistic people, and I remain optimistic. And my feeling is that the relationship between customers and restaurants will have changed for the better. I think customers will appreciate restaurants more, and just as importantly, if not more importantly, restaurateurs and their staff will appreciate customers more. I think we'll have a much more healthy culture for it. But the sad thing is that we've lost so many restaurants along the way. Is there anything else I should say on pandemic?
Well, you had a plan to
I'm furious about it. Well, we'll open 17th of May. We'll open some of our places with a cafe, but it's difficult to make money. And when you think through the problems of, it's wonderful if you're the River Cafe and you've got 100 seats or more outside, that sounds great. But you take the bookings, you have the staff in, you've bought the food, you've prepared it, etc., and there's an April shower, what do you do? Because you can't move people inside, which is what would normally happen. So it's very, very difficult. And most people think they'll struggle to make any return through that period. If I was being a little bit cynical about where we are with furlough and so on, I'd say that we're actually just running the government's universal credit unemployment scheme on their behalf. And unfortunately, a lot of people will be let go at the end of it. It's very sad.
It's very sad. What about plans for the restaurant you're planning to open in Soho? Is that
yes.
on hold at the moment, and future restaurant plans? What's happening with that?
Well, that's a very good point. And on my missing slideshow, there was a rather tantalizing, beguiling watercolor of Manz's. Some of you will remember Manz's, and I think there's going to be quite a lot of confusion because the old Manz's, which I loved dearly, was down on Leicester Square. There was a building. It's all basically gone now. The building's there, but it's been lost. And you might remember it had French neon signs outside, Langouste and Moule and Huître, etc. And it was actually run by Italians. Old Manzi himself came from the Amalfi Coast and walked and worked his way across Europe to open Manzi's. And he was it was an Italian running an English style fish restaurant within a French building. It was a bit bizarre. We've taken inspiration from Manzas, and our restaurant will be bigger. It's up just south of Soho Square, over 2 floors. And again, will be fun. It will be affordable, and it will be in the whole spirit of that seafood of the 50s, but better, one hopes. Other than that, we did pre-pandemic, we signed leases, one in the city for a big Wolsey style operation, which a beautiful building. As you go over London Bridge, it's the building which faces you before you fork either side of it. And also, after many years of requests, we have a site in Notting Hill Gate, which will be very much of the area, very much a local restaurant. They're never repeated in London generally, but they feel like siblings.
So that's exciting. So the big plans are still going ahead, and so we have some more restaurants to look forward to.
Hopefully, yes, absolutely.
And I wanted to ask you about looking at the Walsley's menu, Fisher's. There's, as you said, sort of the Austrian food and that kind of thing on there, but we've also got like chopped liver.
I know.
At the Walsley. Is this?
God, that gave me problems at first. I remember Russell Norman. You might know the restaurateur opened Polpo and Polpetto, etc. He opened Covent Garden, and he was trying to do very authentic Jewish food. And one of the interesting things about it was that whilst I love it, and I thought it was very much in keeping, because of course the Wolsey is in a way Grand Cafe in a Viennese tradition. It's that was how we saw it, but it's also partly brasserie. And the interesting thing about brasseries is that they have a German background in themselves, because most brasseries, the word brasserie comes from a brasseur, and a brasseur is a brewer. So the brasserie were basically pubs where you could get food, hence the brasserie. And when Alsace was being taken backwards and forwards by the French and the Germans, a lot of the brasseurs went to Paris and opened restaurants there. And that's why you get choucroute and so on and so forth in brasseries. We decided to do the chopped liver and the chicken soup in that Central European tradition. Of course, what I hadn't prepared myself for is that everybody would have an opinion as to whether it was right or not. And I remember the first day that I tried the chicken soup, and I thought that the matzo ball dumplings were a little bit firm, and we went with them anyway. There was a bit of discussion, and then a couple were coming out, and I said, "Oh, Jeremy, really nice. We enjoyed the place, but the chicken soup, the matzo balls." I said, "A bit firm." I said, "Yes." And then, "Yeah, I agree with you. You're absolutely right." And then another couple came out and said exactly the same. They enjoyed themselves with the matzo ball. I said, "The matzo ball dumplings are a bit firm." They went, "No, too soft." And then started off. And people would start saying, "I need to give you my mother's chicken soup recipe. I need to give you my grandmother's chopped liver recipe, etc., etc." And it came one time. I have to admit, I got a bit tetchy one day, and there was a wonderful American Jewish guy sitting at a table who he knew very well was listening to me, because somebody started talking about the chopped liver, and he said, "I'm going to have to give you my mother's recipe. It's the best recipe in the world." I said, I was tetchy enough to say I'll be so thrilled. Because that means I will have my collection of 500 of the best chopped liver recipes in the world. And this guy said, "No, you mustn't let people get you." I said, I know, it's just a bad day." He said, "It's a much easier way to do it." And I think I've got the right word. He said, Whenever anybody says anything about your food, whether it's a chopped liver or matzo ball, all you do is put your hands up and say, I know, but the Shema insists we do it that way. And, and I said, Shema, and he said, yeah, you know, the guy who checks everything's kosher. Nobody will argue with you if you do that. I said, done deal. As it happened, we never changed we softened those matzo ball dumplings and we tied it up on the chopped liver recipe, and nobody complains about them now. They're readily accepted. I think the regulars who don't agree just steer away. And but for me, they're absolute fixtures on the menu. I like that heritage.
That's great. What's your absolute favorite dish at the Wellesley that you would have most often, or that you think about?
Do you know, this will sound really strange, but occasionally I treat myself at breakfast to deviled kidneys. It's a particular favorite of mine. But also one of the dishes which I don't know how we do it. I mean, I sort of know how we do it, but I love simple food, and the avocado with mashed salad and olive oil, etc., is absolutely wonderful because it comes in such good condition. I like that simple form of cooking. You know, there are the old favorites. There's our tribute to Peter Langen, and this is the sort of thing we do. Is there's the crostade des œufs de caille, the quail's egg crostade with the mushrooms, etc., and with hollandaise on top of boiled quail's eggs. You know, that's wonderful, but it's more of a showy piece. But you know, the old saying, and Chris and I are very keen on it, is that the best way to open a restaurant is to open a restaurant you want to go to yourself, not imagining what somebody else would do. Otherwise, it's not authentic. So if you believe in it, let's hope more people do.
Great. And we can let you go. Well, we have some questions to go through in a minute, but going back to the Ivy days, can you tell us sort of some of the celebrities that came in? Do you have a funny celebrity story? I know, I think everyone would like to hear something that happened at the Ivy.
Celebrity stories. Now, I'm trying to think. At the Ivy, actually, we used to have the most fun when Princess Margaret came in, because Mitchell, who some people might remember, who sadly died now, as the general manager, and he would approach her at the table to take her order, and she'd be looking at the menu and she would say, I'll have the smoked sturgeon followed by the brill in champagne sauce. And he would look at the menu, because of course these items were not on the menu. And he said, I'm sorry, we don't have those. Oh, really? Oh, well, I suppose I have to make do. He sort of thought she was in Harrods Food Hall, although there was a time I found an old menu from the Ivy which had so many dishes on it. This is back pre-war days, and it would have 12 soups and so on and so forth. And the legend at the top said, this is purely a guide. The chef will be happy to cook whatever you like. But those are different days. We did have an extraordinary number of celebrities, it's true. You know, I've had to turn out armed bodyguards because of stars. I mean, the sort of people that we treasured, of course, were the likes of Harold Pinter and so on and so forth, who would take up the table. But it was the juxtaposition that one day Harold Pinter might be sat next to, I don't know, David Beckham or somebody like that. That's what made it interesting, is because you had such a broad group of people, and we fought very hard. Because any restaurant which becomes dominated by a group, even if it's all theatre or all advertising or something, suddenly pales somewhat in the attraction. But you know, deep down, I loved the artists and, of course, the actors. And the actors were extraordinary, and they all came through and made me very, very happy.
That's great. Okay, I've got a couple of comments here that I'll read, I think, before we ask the questions. We've got a comment here from someone that you know, Edward Wojciechowski, said,
Oh,
I've just
yes.
been informed of the link and I want to remind and congratulate Jeremy, who is a friend.
Oh, that's very nice. No, thank you. It's very nice.
That's great. And we have let me just go to this comment. This is from Jackie and Ruth Danson. American Emmy Award winner Sharon Gless from Cagney and Lacey sends greetings to Jeremy and says,
nice.
I've spent many hours at all of Jeremy's restaurants every night after every performance. There is no better. I'm so grateful for all the memories.
Oh,
so there you go.
Sweet. Yeah, I haven't seen for ages, but that's wonderful. We used to see her a lot. It's amazing how comfortable the Americans had been through the days of Caprice, etc., through to the new restaurants. It was truly wonderful. That's very nice. Thank you.
Lovely. Here's a question from Malcolm. So challenging opening so many wonderful establishments in a relatively short time. Let's see, what issues do you have finding quality professional staff with many EU citizens returning home? Do you have a training program?
Well, it's a very pertinent question because, we have times as many as 80% of people from the European Union, and a lot of them have been with us for 10, 15 years. Sadly, with the advent of Brexit, the Polish left in vast numbers, a very, very hardworking group of people, you would hope, but they, unfortunately, a lot of them were living on estates, and their fellow Brits seemed to think there was a mandate to bully and abuse them, and so they've returned home. We've got a Home Secretary who is openly somewhat contemptuous about hospitality and says they're unskilled workers, so they shouldn't get special consideration. It's really, really going to be difficult now going forward. I mean, just about all our staff have registered, but of course they will in turn start to leave and go home. It's going to be hard to replace them. And it's not just, you look at the fruit pickers in Kent, etc., then yes, it's basically the bodies. You need the bodies to do the work. It's not too skilled work. But what I feel very, very strongly about is there's the culture that is brought, not only just for the restaurants, but for the whole city. And when I think back on our history of immigration, and thank God for, I hated the circumstances, but for the refugees that we received out of Europe, and it's been a wonderful tradition. You look at the Huguenots, we are artistically and creatively a much richer society because the Huguenots were chased out of France and so on and so forth. We really do need to understand that immigration is a wonderful thing and not to be considered bad for the country in any way, shape or form. But it's a very fair question. We're really going to struggle. I mean, the short term, sadly, for other people, it won't be so bad because so many people have lost their jobs. But in time, and short-term thinking doesn't work.
Quite. Okay, let me see. Thank you. What do you do with food that's left over after closing time? Is there anywhere to donate it? That's from Mark.
There's a nice question. We have done in the past. We're pretty good now, and we're very lucky because we're consistent with the amount of people who are coming. It tends to go to staff more than anything else. One of my happiest memories, though, was I just say is that because I like that whole movement. Is back in the 80s, we were closing the Caprice at Christmas for repainting, and in those days you closed for a week, and we had quite a lot of food left over. And when I was living in Wapping, I saw that there was some bottles was a refuge, and I said, get some more fruit, and then I'll drop it off to them on Christmas Eve. And I turned up, and it was a sweet story because I knocked on the door, and the guy was going, yes. I said, I've got some food, and I'll put it over there, he said. And he pointed, and there was a whole load of sort of boxes of tins of spaghetti alphabet, etc. I said, well, can you give me a hand? He, oh, for God's sake. And so he came out, and then as I opened up the car, he went, oh my God, because it was full of food. And he said, this is a miracle, because you won't believe, I've got 120 people. I've got nothing to give them for dessert. And suddenly you've arrived. Where are you from? And I said, I'm not telling you. Just here it is. And for every year, for years to come, we turned up on Christmas Eve with, in time, a van full of food. And every year the drivers are instructed, you never tell them where it's from. Let people think that there's altruism in the world, and we're gone. But there is so much food wastage. I mean, particularly out of supermarkets, of course, because of the dating. We're pretty good, I must say, but it's a nice question.
Thank you. This is from Malcolm. As a foodie and passionate home cook, can you tell me where a love of good food sits in your career, as opposed to love of hospitality, front of house, and business?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. I was not trained as a chef. People think I'm a really good chef. They come, so quite often, if over the years, if I'm cooking at home, I get stuff prepped by the restaurant, because I'm often leaving it 40 minutes before people are actually arriving at home. I haven't done it so much. I don't have a particular dining room at present, but when I did, people would watch me cook and they'd think that I was a brilliant chef. I said, no, I'm a finisher, because I've watched so many chefs finishing food online. I love food, is such an important part of my life, but time is also important. So nothing makes me happier than to be on holiday and spend the day cooking, because that, ironically, it's not a busman's holiday for me. It's actually getting back to what I truly enjoy. But I think somebody said to me recently, is that, you know what, I would return to a restaurant that had okay food, but really nice staff, but I wouldn't return to a restaurant if the food was really nice and the staff weren't. It's really important. My dream of a restaurant is that you walk through the door, you feel as though you're scooped off your feet by the maitre d'hotel. And as you go to your table, you look around, you feel the buzz, you see people, you might be waving to a friend, you might see somebody in compromising situation, you might see celebrity, you arrive at your table. And let's say it's a table of 6 and nobody's got their camera out, nobody's taking photographs or doing text, etc. They're all talking. You sit down and you feel enthused by the restaurant, by your friends. You just don't want it to end. And then at one point, somebody stops and looks down at their dish and they said, do you know what? This is really, really rather good. And then another person said, yeah, and it's fairly priced, isn't it? And they go, yes, and they carry on. That's where the food is for me. It's got to be, when people stop and think about it, they think it's terrific. But it doesn't become the whole show, because sometimes restaurants become temples and they become boring when they are.
I've got 2 questions that are similar, so I'm going to put them together. One is from Raymond, who wants to know if you would consider opening a restaurant in Yorkshire, and Barbara, who'd like to know if you'd open a restaurant in Bournemouth. So I guess the question is, will you expand outside of London?
We've looked at it, we've thought about it. It's getting the critical mass of people to do it. You know what I would do? Interestingly, Bournemouth is where Chris came from originally. So he's very, very much pulled back from the day-to-day operation. Yorkshire, Bournemouth, one thing I sometimes hanker for, and would be the answer to those questions, is that I wouldn't mind semi-retiring and running a restaurant in Yorkshire by myself, etc., but not as a satellite from London, because I think what makes restaurants really special is proprietorship. And when people say, which restaurant shall I go to, or take my husband on his birthday, my wife on the anniversary or whatever, I often say, go to the restaurant you're known best, because they'll make a fuss of you. And I think that's what we all really, really want, is to walk into a place where somebody recognizes us, lauds us, praises, you know, and is happy to see us. And there's plenty of restaurants and chains, and in fact, a chain came out of, you know, one of our old restaurants where, you know, they look okay and they serve everything okay, but ultimately it's not particularly convivial. You're going through the motions. And I think this is where it's going to change. I think people with retail and all these different things, people are going to think that service is luxury now, not what you eat, not what you buy. It's service is part of the luxury.
I'm going to agree with that, definitely. Peter is asking, was there a design team who you worked with, who worked with you on your overall brief for, I assume, each restaurant, all the restaurants?
Well, most of our restaurants have been done by, originally were done by David Collins. David Collins was, the last one he did for us was Colbert. Actually, we fought quite a lot. He wanted to make it very different. And he sadly died prematurely. But the person who was working with him throughout since the Delaunay was a guy called Shane Brady. And Shane is wonderful. He set up his own practice and he does all our restaurants, and I wouldn't work with anybody other than him. And the reason being is that, I mean, he's not precious about his designs, etc. He's really keen to work with somebody. But what happens, I normally give him the idea and it's like this, and it's formed, but in that shape, and he comes back with this and he grows it and he elaborates it and he makes it better than I could do. And so it's one of the best business relationships I've ever had, and it works incredibly well.
That's wonderful. And we'll have two more questions, Jeremy, if that's okay. And then
sure.
For all your time. Peter wants to know, how do you keep up the high standards in all the restaurants? One of the big enemies of restaurateurs is complacency, and the other is arrogance. And particularly if you're opening restaurants, a lot of restaurateurs do very well with the restaurant and they open a second one and don't really spend enough time at the first one. You really have to do it. And I think I could probably illustrate my answer to this. Is I remember one year we won award, best restaurant or something for the Wolseley. And I sat the team down and I said, how are we going to win that next year? And somebody fell into the trap, and the older staff know the trap, and they said, by maintaining our standards, which is a fair answer. And I said, nope, maintaining our standards, if that's your aspiration, we're going to go bankrupt. They said, well, how can that be? I said, because if your aspiration in life is to maintain your standards, actually, you never quite do it, because and meanwhile, whilst you're trying to keep that graph going up, but other people have learned from you and they're advancing much quicker. So the only way to really keep up is constantly be trying to improve. And I think that is why a lot of restaurants disappoint, is because they think they've made it and they rest on their laurels. So it's never enough. It's never good enough. But also it's getting the staff to take pride in it themselves, and that they feel proprietorial about it, that it's not purely through instruction. The thing I would say though, is as restaurateurs, is that the easiest way to run a restaurant is to do it the hardest way, and that means being there. And it's the difference between a lot of people who are restaurant owners now, and they have big portfolios of restaurants, they're doing okay, but they're restaurant owners rather than restaurateurs, and the restaurateurs are the people who are actually there. And the staff, if they know that you may walk through the door at any moment or already there, they raise their game far more. And I've seen you there, Jeremy, and you're keeping an eye. So I know
try to,
if anyone goes to any of your restaurants, there's a chance of catching you in there. So that's an incentive too, to say hello.
Very nice.
And I think our last question is a really good question from Mark, and he wants to know, will you write an autobiography?
Well, funny enough, my wife is bullying me on that at this very moment. And one of the problems was always is the discretion of not actually giving away too much about people and so on. It's not out of the question, but it's fair to say that restaurant biographies are also really potentially very boring because they become a list of names, etc. And I actually know this because I've got a collection of them, a rather perverse collection, and they'll begin with lines like, "It was my honor to serve the Begum Aga Khan," or something like that, and you go, or if you think of Leone Quo Vadis, his autobiography, he called it "I Shall Die on the Carpet." So this notion that one day he'd be walking through carrying a Dover sole and carpet. But it does interest me if it can be something which is not purely me talking about who I've met, etc., but life experience. And it's always important to me is that if other people's lives can be enhanced by my experience, then that gives me a great deal of gratification.
Well, we hope to see that on the bookshelves. And then you can come and give a book talk for the AJR.
There you go.
I'll book you now. We'll book you now. Well, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you for being here with the AJR and Jeremy King. And Jeremy, a huge thank you to you. From 1 minute on question time to the AJR, you're everywhere. So thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you. My only regret is that I didn't get the tech right and I didn't bring the proper slideshow. But hopefully we managed to muddle through. So thank you very much.
Managed very well, and the slides were great, and you gave us a flavor for all the restaurants, and that's just wonderful. We hope to be able to be back there soon and support you and wish you all the best for the future.
Okay,
so thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you. I look forward to seeing you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Thanks, Jeremy.
Bye-bye.